a woman's hand slammed across the face of the most feared crime boss in the city, and for 3 terrifying seconds, nobody inside the restaurant dared to breathe. The sound of that slap echoed through the private dining hall like a gunshot. Crystal glasses trembled against marble tables. Expensive cigars stopped halfway to trembling lips. A senator seated near the corner quietly lowered his eyes toward the floor, pretending he had seen nothing at all. The musicians performing near the stage slowly stopped playing one by one until silence swallowed the entire room. Every single person there knew the same terrifying truth. The man she had just humiliated in front of everyone was not an ordinary customer. He was Ronan Castelli, the man newspapers called a businessman, politicians called a partner, and enemies called a nightmare. Some claimed he once shut down an entire shipping port because a man looked at him the wrong way. Others whispered that judges disappeared after ruling against him. But none of those stories mattered in that moment. Because standing directly in front of him, breathing hard with fury in her eyes, was a waitress who had absolutely no idea whose face she had just slapped. Her name was Raven Vale, 26 years old, working double shifts at a private underground restaurant hidden beneath one of the richest districts in the city. Most nights, she carried champagne to wealthy men who treated people like furniture. She had learned to ignore wandering hands, cruel insults, and entitled customers with too much money and too little humanity. But tonight was different. The second Ronan grabbed her wrist and called her a useless little waitress. Something inside her snapped instantly. She didn't pause to think. She didn't hesitate. Her hand moved before her fear could catch up. And now every pair of eyes inside that restaurant stared at her like she had signed her own death sentence. 2 armed guards rushed toward her immediately, chairs scraping violently across the floor as they reached beneath their jackets. One woman near the bar quietly whispered a prayer under her breath. Another man slowly backed away from the table. Terrified bullets were about to fly, but Ronan Castelli never moved. He sat there calmly, his head slightly turned from the force of the slap, staring down at the gold ring on his finger, like he was processing something far more dangerous than anger. Then, slowly, almost unbelievably, Ronan began to smile. It wasn't warmth. It wasn't amusement. It was the kind of smile that made people disappear. One of his bodyguards leaned closer and asked quietly, "Boss, should we take care of her?" Raven's breathing became uneven, but she still refused to step back. Even with armed men surrounding her, she kept her chin raised defiantly. Ronan finally lifted his eyes toward her again, and for the first time all night, something unfamiliar crossed his face. Interest. Real interest. The kind a predator shows after finally finding something worth chasing. He stood up slowly from his chair, towering over her in a black tailored suit that probably cost more than everything she owned combined. Tattoos disappeared beneath the cuffs of his sleeves. His jaw tightened once before he stepped closer, close enough to make her pulse stumble in her chest. The entire room waited for violence. Instead, Ronan spoke softly. "What's your name?" Raven swallowed hard, but answered anyway. "Raven." He stared at her for another long second before speaking again. "You're either the bravest woman I've ever met or the most reckless." Raven crossed her arms tightly. Maybe both. A dangerous grin touched his mouth again. "Bring her with us. Engage in our comments section and tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Whether you're in Georgia, Moscow, Ohio, California, New York, Mexico City, Tokyo, drop your location below. And if you're new to this channel, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what happened after that slap would shake the criminal underworld in ways nobody expected. Raven thought she was being dragged away for punishment. She thought she was about to disappear into some dark basement where powerful men buried their mistakes. But Ronan Castelli had no intention of killing her. In fact, the moment she slapped him, something changed inside him completely. For years, women around Ronan obeyed every command, before he even spoke. They smiled when told to smile. They laughed when told to laugh. Fear controlled every room he entered, but Raven had looked directly into his eyes without trembling once. She challenged him publicly, humiliated him publicly. And somehow, instead of anger, all Ronan felt was fascination. As his men grabbed Raven by the arm and escorted her toward the private elevator hidden behind the restaurant kitchen, whispers exploded throughout the dining hall. Nobody understood why she was still alive. A bartender secretly recorded the entire scene beneath the counter. A politician quietly called his driver to leave immediately. One old mafia associate sitting near the back stared toward the elevator doors and muttered words that would later haunt everyone involved. That girl just changed her entire life. Inside the elevator, Raven finally tried pulling away from the guards. "Get your hands off me," she snapped angrily, jerking her arm free for a second before another guard blocked the exit. Ronan remained silent behind her, watching carefully. The elevator climbed higher through private floors, hidden from the public, above the restaurant. Raven's heartbeat pounded harder with every passing second, but pride refused to let her show fear. "If you're trying to scare me, it's not working," she lied, coldly. Ronan tilted his head slightly. "You should be scared." The calmness in his voice somehow frightened her more than yelling would have. When the elevator doors finally opened, Raven expected dark hallways and armed criminals. Instead, she stepped into a massive luxury penthouse overlooking the glowing city skyline. Marble floors stretched beneath dim golden lights. Expensive paintings lined the walls. Guards stood silently near every entrance. End quote. This wasn't a hideout. It was a kingdom. Ronan loosened the cuff of his sleeve slowly before turning toward her again. "From this moment on," he said quietly, "your life belongs to me." Raven let out a sharp laugh, despite the fear crawling through her stomach. "You're insane." Ronan walked closer until only inches separated them again. "No," he answered calmly. "I'm the only man in this city who can protect you after what you did tonight." Raven frowned in confusion. "Protect me from who?" Ronan's expression darkened instantly. "From everyone who watched you slap me and survive." Raven stared at Ronan Castelli like he had completely lost his mind. The city's most feared crime boss had just told her she needed protection after humiliating him in front of half the underground elite, and somehow, the terrifying part was that he sounded completely serious. She stepped backward carefully, her eyes scanning the massive penthouse for exits, weapons, anything useful. But every hallway had guards. Every elevator required security access. Even the windows were locked behind reinforced glass. Ronan noticed her looking around and gave a faint smile that only irritated her more. "You can stop searching," he said calmly. "Nobody leaves this floor without my permission." Raven folded her arms immediately. "You kidnapped the wrong woman if you think I'm staying here quietly." Ronan walked toward the bar near the fireplace and poured himself a drink like they were discussing weather instead of imprisonment. "You slapped me in a room full of dangerous men," he replied. "Half of them would kill you just to prove loyalty to me. The other half would try using you against me." Raven shook her head angrily. "Then let them try." Ronan finally looked back at her fully, and the amusement faded from his face. "That attitude," he said softly, "is exactly why I took you." The tension between them thickened with every second. Raven hated the way he looked at her, like he had already decided she belonged there. She had spent her entire life fighting control. Close quote. Her father disappeared when she was 13. Her mother drowned herself in debt and addiction before dying 3 years later. Since then, Raven survived alone, learning quickly that the world respected force more than kindness. Nobody protected girls like her. Nobody saved them. And men like Ronan Castelli were usually the reason women ended up broken in the first place. Yet standing inside his penthouse, something felt different from what she expected. Dangerous, yes, but controlled, calculated. Ronan didn't touch her unnecessarily. He didn't scream. He didn't threaten her physically. Somehow, That calmness unsettled her more than violence would have. One of the guards approached quietly. "Boss, should we prepare the east room?" Ronan nodded, once, without taking his eyes off Raven. "And lock the private elevator." Raven's anger exploded immediately. "I'm not your prisoner." Ronan took a slow sip from his glass. "That's exactly what you are." She moved toward him before fear could stop her. "You think money and guards make you a king?" she snapped. "You're just another arrogant criminal hiding behind armed men." The room became deadly silent again. Several guards looked ready to intervene instantly, but Ronan only smiled faintly. "Interesting," he murmured. "You still don't know when to stop." Raven expected punishment after that. Maybe a slapback, maybe threats. Instead, Ronan dismissed every guard from the room with a single glance. One by one, they disappeared, leaving only the two of them standing beneath the dim golden lights of the penthouse. That somehow felt even more dangerous. Ronan placed his drink down carefully before loosening the tie around his neck. "Do you know what most people do when they stand this close to me?" he asked quietly. Raven refused to answer. "They beg," he continued. "Some cry, some offer money, some promise loyalty they don't mean." E stepped closer, slowly. "But you—" His eyes lowered briefly toward her mouth before returning to her eyes again. "You look at me like you'd burn this entire building down before kneeling." Raven swallowed once but forced herself not to move. "Maybe I would." Something dark flickered behind his expression then. Respect, desire, obsession. It frightened her, because it looked genuine. Ronan leaned closer, until his voice dropped low enough that only she could hear it. "Careful, Raven." His eyes locked onto hers intensely. "You're becoming very dangerous to me." Her pulse stumbled unexpectedly. She hated that part of her noticed how attractive he was standing there, in that black suit with tattoos shadowing his hands and a voice calm enough to hide murder beneath it. Raven immediately stepped away from him, angry at herself for even thinking it. "I'm not interested in whatever twisted game you're playing," she said sharply. Ronan's gaze followed her slowly. "That's the problem," he answered quietly. "I am. Hours later, Raven sat alone inside the luxurious bedroom they forced her into, trying to process how her entire life had changed in one night. The room looked like something stolen from royalty. Massive bed, silk sheets, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glowing skyline, expensive dresses hanging untouched inside an open closet, but no amount of luxury changed the truth. The door locked from the outside. She tested it 3 times before finally kicking it hard in frustration. "Open this damn door!" she shouted. No response came. Raven paced the room furiously, trying not to panic. Everything had happened too fast. One moment, she was serving wine at the restaurant. The next, she was trapped inside a mafia king's penthouse, while armed men guarded every hallway. She grabbed a crystal vase from the table and hurled it against the wall violently, glass exploding across the floor. "Feel better?" a voice asked suddenly from behind her. Raven spun around instantly. Ronan stood near the doorway, calm as ever, his hands inside his pockets like he owned the air she breathed. She glared at him. "Get out!" He glanced toward the shattered glass before looking back at her. "You have expensive taste in destruction." Raven moved closer, angrily. "You can't keep me here forever." Ronan studied her face quietly for several long seconds before answering. "That depends." "On what?" she snapped. "Ha, ha, ha." His expression hardened slightly. "On whether you survive what's coming." Raven frowned immediately. "What does that mean?" Ronan walked further into the room now, his polished shoes crunching softly over broken glass. "The men who sat in that restaurant tonight weren't businessmen," he said. "They were wolves pretending to wear suits." His voice remained calm, but there was something colder underneath it now. "You embarrassed me in front of them, publicly." Raven crossed her arms. "So, this is about your pride?" "No," Ronan answered instantly. "If this were about pride, you'd already be dead." That answer sent an uncomfortable chill through her chest. He stopped near the window, overlooking the city lights below. Men like them fear weakness more than death, he continued quietly. And the second they saw you survive that slap, he glanced toward her again. You became important. Raven stared at him suspiciously. Important to who? Ronan's jaw tightened slightly before he answered. To my enemies. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Raven suddenly realized this situation was much larger than one moment inside a restaurant. There were people watching now. Dangerous people. And somehow, she had become part of something she didn't understand. Ronan studied her carefully again before speaking one final time. Get some sleep. Raven laughed bitterly. You think I can sleep after this? Ronan moved toward the door slowly. No, he admitted. But tomorrow will be worse. Then, without another word, the Mafia King walked out, and the lock clicked shut behind him once again. Raven barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard the sound of her own hand slapping Ronan Castelli across the face again, followed by the deadly silence that swallowed the restaurant afterward. She kept replaying the expressions on those people's faces, the fear, the shock, the certainty that she was about to die. Yet somehow, instead of burying her body somewhere beneath the city, Ronan locked her inside a luxury penthouse and watched her like she was something valuable. That confused her more than the danger itself. By sunrise, frustration finally pushed her out of bed. She walked straight toward the locked bedroom door and started banging hard against it again. Open this door, she shouted. I'm not staying here another second. Moments later, the lock clicked. Raven immediately stepped back, ready to attack whoever entered first. But instead of guards, Ronan himself walked into the room wearing a black dress shirt with the sleeves rolled halfway up his tattooed forearms. He looked irritatingly calm for a man running one of the most feared criminal empires in the country. Good morning, he said casually. Raven glared at him. You're insane if you think I'm playing house with you. Ronan ignored the insult completely and placed a small tray of food on the table near the window. Eat. Raven looked at the breakfast before turning back toward him. I'd rather starve. Ronan gave a quiet sigh. You're going to need your strength today. Her expression hardened instantly. For what? Ronan adjusted the watch on his wrist slowly before answering. You're coming with me. Less than an hour later, Raven found herself seated inside a private lounge, hidden beneath one of Ronan's casinos, while armed men watched every entrance. She refused to sit close to him, choosing the opposite side of the leather booth instead. But even from across the table, she could feel his eyes drifting toward her repeatedly. Around them, wealthy criminals exchanged briefcases, whispered deals, and fake smiles beneath dim chandeliers. The entire place felt like a kingdom built on fear and blood. Raven leaned slightly closer and lowered her voice. Why bring me here? Ronan calmly lit a cigar before answering. Because people need to see you beside me. Raven stared at him in disbelief. You barely know me. Ronan exhaled smoke slowly. I know enough. Before she could respond, several men entered the lounge at once, and the atmosphere shifted immediately. Conversations quieted. Even the guards straightened slightly. At the center of the group stood a tall man, with silver rings covering his fingers, and cold, pale eyes that settled directly on Raven. He smiled, but there was nothing friendly about it. So, the rumors were true, he said, slowly. The great Ronan Castelli finally found himself a little problem. Ronan's expression darkened instantly. Watch your mouth, Lucien. The man only laughed softly before sitting across from them without invitation. Raven noticed instantly how everyone around him seemed nervous, dangerous, on. Like they expected violence at any second. Lucien's eyes never left her face. You're the waitress, he murmured. The one who slapped him. Raven stayed silent. Lucien leaned back comfortably. You know, most women around Ronan spend years trying to get his attention. His smile widened slightly. You got it, with one hand. Act. Ronan's patience visibly thinned. Say what you came here to say. Lucien finally looked away from Raven and toward Ronan. There's movement at the docks, he said quietly. Someone's making deals behind your back. Ronan remained still. Who? Lucien shrugged casually. That's the interesting part. His gaze shifted toward Raven again. Word is spreading fast about your new companion. Some people think she's a weakness. Raven felt tension snap across the room instantly. Ronan slowly leaned forward, his voice calm enough to become frightening. And what do you think? Lucien smiled carefully this time. I think weak men hide women. He glanced toward Raven once more. Strong men turn them into weapons. The statement hung heavily between them. Raven didn't fully understand the criminal world around her yet, but she understood one thing clearly. These men weren't discussing her like a person. They were discussing her like power, like leverage, like something dangerous that could either strengthen Ronan's empire or destroy it completely. Lucien eventually stood and adjusted his suit slowly before leaving, but not before leaning close enough to Raven to whisper something only she could hear. Careful around him. His eyes flicked briefly toward Ronan. Men like Ronan don't fall in love. Then he walked away. Raven tried ignoring the strange feeling that settled in her stomach after those words, but somehow they stayed with her long after he disappeared. That evening, Ronan brought Raven back to the penthouse in complete silence. The tension between them felt heavier now, different, more dangerous. Raven finally stopped near the window overlooking the city skyline and turned toward him sharply. Why are these people talking about me like I matter? Ronan removed his watch slowly before answering. Because they're trying to figure out what you are to me. Raven crossed her arms immediately. And what am I? Ronan's gaze locked onto hers. I haven't decided yet. The answer irritated her instantly. I'm not some object you own. Ronan stepped closer without hesitation. No, he said quietly. You're the first person who's walked into my life without fear. His voice lowered slightly. Do you know how rare that is? Raven tried looking away, but his eyes held hers too intensely. Fear keeps people alive, she answered softly. Ronan moved even closer now. Fear also keeps people weak. Her heartbeat suddenly became difficult to ignore. There was something dangerous about the way he looked at her when nobody else was around. Like every wall around him lowered slightly. Like beneath the cold Mafia king existed something darker and far more emotional than he wanted anyone to see. Raven hated how aware she had become of his presence. The scent of smoke and expensive cologne. The tattoos disappearing beneath his sleeves. The calmness hiding violence underneath it. She stepped backward slightly. You keep staring at me like you're trying to figure something out. Ronan's jaw tightened faintly. Maybe I am. What? She asked quietly. His eyes drifted slowly across her face before returning to hers again. Whether you're going to ruin me, he admitted. Before Raven could respond, gunshots suddenly exploded somewhere below the penthouse. Loud, violent, close enough to shake the windows. Ronan instantly pulled Raven down beside him as more shots rang through the building. Guards began shouting outside the suite. Raven's breathing caught sharply. What's happening? She whispered. Ronan reached beneath the table beside him and pulled out a handgun with terrifying calmness. Stay behind me. Another burst of gunfire echoed through the hallway outside. Then came screaming. Raven's pulse pounded wildly as Ronan moved toward the door with deadly focus in his eyes. She grabbed his arm instinctively before he stepped away. Ronan. He looked back at her briefly, and for the first time since she met him, she saw genuine fear flash across his face. Not fear for himself, fear for her. Lock the bedroom door, he ordered quietly. And if anyone enters besides me, he pressed the gun into her trembling hands, carefully. Shoot first. Then, the Mafia king disappeared into the chaos outside while bullets continued tearing through the building. The moment Ronan disappeared beyond the penthouse doors, Raven realized how truly alone she was. Gunfire exploded across the hallway outside in violent bursts, followed by screams that echoed through the upper floors of the building. Her hands trembled around the handgun Ronan had forced into them moments earlier. She had never held a weapon before in her life. The metal felt heavy, wrong, dangerous. Yet somehow the memory of Ronan's expression before leaving disturbed her more than the gun itself. For the first time since she met him, the cold control slipped from his face completely. He looked worried, desperate even. And somehow, that frightened her far more than the bullets ripping through the penthouse walls outside. Raven quickly locked herself inside the bedroom exactly as he ordered, but the sounds beyond the door only grew worse. Men shouting commands, furniture crashing, rapid gunfire shaking the floor beneath her feet. At one point, she heard someone screaming in pain, somewhere nearby, before sudden silence cut them off completely. Her breathing became uneven as panic slowly tightened around her chest. She kept telling herself this had nothing to do with her. These were criminals, destroying each other like they always did. Yet deep down, she knew the attack tonight was connected to one thing: her. Minutes dragged by, painfully. Raven stayed crouched near the bed, with the handgun pointed toward the door, trying to steady her breathing. Then, suddenly, footsteps approached outside the bedroom. Slow, heavy. The doorknob moved slightly. Raven froze instantly. "Ronan?" she called softly. No answer came. The handle twisted harder this time. Her pulse exploded inside her chest. "I have a gun!" she shouted desperately. Silence followed for one long second before a male voice answered from outside. "You must be the famous Waitress." Raven's stomach dropped immediately. It wasn't Ronan. The voice sounded amused, calm, dangerous. "Boss says you've caused quite a lot of trouble already." The handle rattled violently now. Raven backed away from the door, raising the weapon with shaking hands. "Go away," she yelled. The man outside laughed quietly. "That's the problem," he replied. "I came all this way specifically for you." Then the first bullet blasted through the lock. Raven screamed and stumbled backward as wood splintered across the floor. More shots followed instantly. The bedroom door burst inward violently. Raven fired the handgun blindly, without even aiming, the sound deafening inside the room. A man cursed loudly outside. Another gunshot shattered the mirror beside her head. Raven dropped behind the bed just as armed men rushed into the suite. Her heartbeat pounded so hard she could barely think. Everything became chaos. Smoke, shouting, footsteps. She crawled desperately across the floor, trying to escape, while bullets tore through furniture around her. Then, suddenly, another shot rang out from the doorway. Different, precise. One attacker collapsed instantly. Another followed seconds later. And then Ronan Castelli stormed into the room like death itself. Raven had never seen a man look more terrifying. Blood stained the collar of Ronan's black shirt. His jaw tightened with pure fury as he fired again without hesitation, dropping the last armed intruder before they could reach her. The room fell silent except for Raven's ragged breathing. Ronan immediately crossed the room toward her. "Are you hurt?" he demanded sharply, grabbing her face carefully to inspect her. Raven could barely process what had happened. Her voice shook badly. "I shot someone." Ronan looked toward the body near the door briefly, before returning his attention to her again. "Good," he said, coldly. "You were supposed to." Raven stared at him in shock. Ronan suddenly pulled her tightly against his chest, holding her harder than she expected. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Raven could feel his heart pounding heavily beneath his shirt. He was shaken too, angry, relieved. Something about that realization changed the atmosphere between them instantly. Ronan slowly pulled back enough to look at her again, his hands still gripping her arms firmly. "Do you understand now?" he asked, quietly. "This isn't a game." Raven looked past him toward the dead men lying across the bedroom floor. Blood spread slowly beneath one body near the broken doorway. She swallowed hard. "Who sent them?" Ronan's expression darkened immediately. Someone trying to send me a message. His eyes locked onto hers intensely. And that message was you. The attack changed everything after that night. Ronan doubled security across every property he owned. Guards followed Raven constantly now. Nobody entered the penthouse without clearance. Nobody even looked at her too long without being watched carefully afterward. Word spread quickly through the underworld that enemies had already started targeting the waitress Ronan Castelli refused to let go. Some believed she was his mistress. Others believed she was leverage against him. But the most dangerous rumors claimed something far worse, that Ronan was falling in love. Raven overheard those whispers everywhere during the following days, especially inside the casino lounges and private clubs. Ronan dragged her into beside him. She hated how people stared at her now. Men measured her carefully, like she had become part of the criminal empire overnight. Women looked at her with envy or pity depending on how much they feared Ronan. Yet through all of it, Ronan never once denied the rumors. In fact, he seemed to enjoy watching the city wonder what she meant to him. One evening, during a private dinner with several crime families, Raven finally lost patience completely. "Why do you keep forcing me into these meetings?" she snapped quietly, while others talked nearby. Ronan barely looked up from his drink. "Because they need to see your face." Raven glared at him. "You're using me." Ronan's expression remained unreadable. "Yes." The honesty caught her off guard. "At least you admit it," she muttered bitterly. Ronan finally turned toward her fully then, his eyes darker than usual beneath the dim lighting. "I'm also protecting you," he answered quietly. "The only reason nobody's touched you since the attack is because they know what would happen if they tried." Raven looked away immediately after that because part of her hated hearing the truth in his words. Before Ronan, she had spent years surviving alone. Nobody protected her. Nobody stood between her and danger. Yet somehow this violent, possessive man had become the first person willing to burn cities down to keep her alive. That realization unsettled her deeply, especially because she had started noticing things about Ronan she didn't want to notice. The way he always positioned himself between her and strangers automatically. The way his voice softened slightly whenever he spoke directly to her. The way his entire mood darkened whenever another man looked at her too long. It was possessive, intense, completely dangerous. And somehow, against her better judgment, a small part of her was beginning to feel safer near him than anywhere else. That terrified her most of all. Later that night, Raven stood alone on the penthouse balcony trying to clear her thoughts when Ronan stepped outside beside her. The city lights stretched endlessly below them, while silence settled between them comfortably for the first time. "You handled yourself well tonight," he said quietly. Raven folded her arms against the cool air. "You mean pretending not to panic while your criminal friends stared at me?" A faint smile touched his mouth briefly. "Most people panic around me." Raven looked toward him slowly. "Maybe I'm starting to understand you." Ronan's expression shifted slightly at those words. "And what have you decided?" he asked softly. Raven hesitated longer than she expected. "I think," she swallowed once. "I think you're lonely." Ronan stared at her in silence after that. No anger, no denial, just silence, heavy enough to reveal she was right. Then, slowly, almost painfully, he stepped closer beside her. "Lonely men," he murmured quietly, "become very dangerous when they finally find something they care about." Raven looked up at him, her heartbeat suddenly unsteady again. And before she could move away, Ronan gently brushed his fingers beneath her chin and kissed her for the first time. The kiss should have terrified her. Raven knew that the second Ronan Castelli's lips touched hers on that balcony overlooking the city. This was the same man people feared more than prison, more than death, more than war itself. A man capable of ordering executions over a single betrayal. A man whose enemies disappeared without graves. Yet none of that crossed her mind during those first few seconds. All she felt was the way his hand tightened gently against her jaw, like he had wanted to kiss her for far longer than he would ever admit. Ronan kissed her, with control at first, slow and deliberate. But beneath that calmness was something deeper. Hunger, possession, relief. Like finding her had silenced something restless inside him. Raven should have pushed him away immediately. Instead, her fingers instinctively grabbed the front of his shirt as the tension between them finally shattered completely. When Ronan finally pulled back slightly, both of them were breathing harder than before. The city lights reflected across his dark eyes, while he studied her face carefully, almost like he was waiting for her to regret it. Raven hated herself for the truth she realized in that moment. She didn't regret it at all. Ronan rested his forehead lightly against hers for one brief second before stepping away again, his self-control returning almost instantly. That somehow frustrated her more than if he had lost control completely. Raven folded her arms tightly. "So what now?" she asked quietly. Ronan stared at her for another long moment before answering. "Now, things become complicated." Raven let out a dry laugh. "Complicated?" She gestured toward the penthouse behind them. "You kidnapped me, locked me inside your mansion, and dragged me into a criminal war." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "I think we passed complicated a while ago." A faint smirk touched Ronan's mouth before disappearing again. "You still argue with me after everything." Raven looked directly into his eyes. Someone has to. For the first time since meeting him, she saw something softer flicker through his expression. Not weakness, something rarer. Admiration. But before either of them could speak again, Ronan's phone suddenly rang sharply inside his pocket. The shift in his face happened instantly after he answered. The warmth vanished. The Mafia King returned. "When?" he asked coldly into the phone. Silence followed, while he listened carefully. Raven watched the tension tighten across his jaw. "Lock the docks down," he ordered, finally. "Nobody leaves until I get there." He ended the call and turned toward her again immediately. "You're staying here tonight." Raven frowned. "What happened?" What? Ronan reached for his jacket near the balcony door. "One of my shipments was attacked." His eyes darkened slightly. "3 of my men are dead." Raven's stomach tightened. "Because of me?" Ronan paused briefly before answering. "Because my enemies think you've become important to me." His silence afterward confirmed the rest without needing words. 2 hours later, Raven sat alone inside the penthouse again, while the television played muted news reports she barely noticed. Her mind kept replaying the balcony kiss, alongside the growing realization that she was becoming emotionally trapped inside Ronan's world. She should have hated him. Every logical part of her knew that. Yet each time danger appeared, Ronan protected her without hesitation. Each time someone threatened her, his entire empire moved violently in response. It confused her. Men like Ronan weren't supposed to care about anyone. Around midnight, the penthouse doors finally opened again. Raven looked up immediately as Ronan entered with several guards behind him. The second she saw the blood staining his knuckles, she stood instantly. "You're hurt." Ronan removed his jacket slowly, like the injuries meant nothing. "It's not mine." That answer chilled her more than if it had been. One of the guards handed Ronan a folder quietly before leaving the room. Raven watched him pour himself a drink in silence, his expression darker than usual. "What happened at the docks?" she asked carefully. Ronan stared into the amber liquid inside his glass for several seconds before answering. "Someone betrayed me." Raven stepped closer slowly. "Did you find out who?" Ronan finally looked toward her, and something dangerous moved behind his eyes. "Yes." The way he said it made her pulse tighten immediately. "And?" Ronan's jaw flexed once before he answered. He begged. Raven suddenly understood exactly what that meant. A heavy silence filled the penthouse afterward. Ronan noticed the shift in her face instantly. "You're afraid of me now," he said quietly. Raven opened her mouth to deny it, but the words refused to come. Ronan gave a faint nod like he expected that reaction all along. "Good," he murmured bitterly. You should be. The following days became even more dangerous. Ronan started taking Raven everywhere beside him now. Private meetings, underground casinos, elite parties filled with politicians, pretending not to recognize criminals standing beside them. And with every appearance, the rumors surrounding them grew stronger. Some believed Ronan planned to marry her. Others claimed she was manipulating him. But the whispers that spread fastest were the ones calling Raven the future queen of the Castelli Empire. Raven tried ignoring them, but deep down she felt the shift happening around her. Guards listened when she spoke now. People stepped aside when she entered rooms beside Ronan. Even his closest associates had stopped treating her like temporary entertainment. They were beginning to fear her, too. One evening during a gathering inside a private mansion, Raven finally noticed something strange. A blonde woman seated across the room kept staring at her with visible hatred. Elegant dress, diamond jewelry, cold eyes sharp enough to cut glass. Raven leaned slightly toward Ronan. "Who's that?" Ronan followed her gaze briefly before his expression hardened. "Vivienne Moreau." Raven frowned. "And why does she look like she wants me dead?" Ronan calmly sipped his drink. "Because she expected to become my wife someday." Raven nearly choked on her champagne. "What?" Ronan looked amused by her reaction for the first time all night. "Our families discussed an arrangement years ago." Raven stared at him in disbelief. "You were engaged?" "No," Ronan answered calmly. "I refused." Raven glanced back toward Vivienne again. She clearly didn't take that well. Almost immediately, Vivienne began walking toward them through the crowded ballroom. Every step carried confidence and fury together. By the time she reached them, the tension surrounding their table had become impossible to ignore. Vivienne's eyes moved slowly across Raven's face before settling on Ronan. "So this is the waitress," she said coldly. Raven crossed her arms instantly. "And you must be the bitter ex." Several nearby guests immediately looked away to avoid the explosion they sensed coming. Vivienne's expression darkened instantly. "You have no idea whose world you've stepped into," she warned quietly. Raven refused to back down. "Funny?" she replied. "People keep saying that." Ronan finally stood between them before things escalated further. "Enough." Vivienne's eyes snapped toward him immediately. "You're humiliating yourself over her." Ronan's face became unreadable again. "Careful, Vivienne." But the woman ignored the warning completely. "She's a waitress, Ronan." Her voice sharpened slightly. "She doesn't belong beside you." Raven expected Ronan to stay silent. Instead, he answered without hesitation. "That's where you're wrong." The room fell quiet around them. Even Vivienne looked caught off guard by the certainty in his voice. Ronan slowly reached for Raven's hand in front of everyone there. His grip tightened possessively around her fingers before he spoke again. "She belongs exactly where I put her." Raven's heartbeat stumbled hard at those words, not because of the possessiveness, but because part of her realized he meant them completely. Vivienne stared between them for several painful seconds before finally stepping back. But before leaving, she looked directly at Raven one final time. "Women who stay beside men like Ronan don't survive very long." Then she disappeared into the crowd. Raven tried ignoring the uneasy feeling left behind after the warning, but something in Vivienne's eyes felt genuine. Later that night, as Ronan drove them back toward the penthouse through the glowing city streets, Raven quietly asked the question, lingering in her mind. "Am I really safe with you?" Ronan kept his eyes on the road for several long seconds before finally answering. "No." Raven's chest tightened slightly. Ronan glanced toward her briefly, his voice lower now. "But you're far more dangerous without me." Raven did not sleep after Ronan's answer that night. The words stayed inside her head long after the city outside the penthouse windows went dark. "You're far more dangerous without me." Part of her hated how true it sounded now. Before Ronan Castelli, her life had been small and difficult, but it had belonged to her. She worked exhausting shifts, fought off cruel customers, and worried constantly about unpaid bills. Yet, she still woke up every morning knowing who she was. Now, everything had changed. Armed guards followed her through hallways. Criminals whispered her name in underground casinos. Powerful men watched her closely during meetings, like she had become part of the balance of power inside the city. And somehow, the most frightening part was how naturally Ronan had pulled her into his world. She told herself repeatedly that she needed to escape before she lost herself completely. But every time she imagined leaving, another thought followed immediately after it. The men hunting Ronan would come for her first. That truth trapped her more effectively than any locked door ever could. The next morning, Raven walked into the penthouse kitchen, determined to avoid Ronan completely after the emotions of the previous night. But the second she entered the room, she stopped short. Ronan stood near the counter wearing dark slacks and a fitted black shirt, casually making coffee like he wasn't one of the most feared men in organized crime. For a moment, the scene almost looked normal, and that somehow unsettled her more than violence ever did. Ronan glanced toward her briefly. "You're awake early." Raven crossed her arms carefully. "I couldn't sleep." Ronan poured coffee into 2 cups without asking if she wanted any. "Vivian got inside your head." Raven leaned against the counter. "She warned me." Ronan finally handed her a cup. "Vivian warns everyone." Raven looked directly at him. "Was she wrong?" Ronan held her gaze steadily for several seconds before answering. "No." The honesty caught her off guard again. "People close to me get hurt." His voice remained calm, but she noticed exhaustion underneath it now. "That's why I spent years refusing attachments." Raven looked down at the coffee cup, warming her hands. "Then why me?" she asked quietly. The room fell silent for a moment. Ronan stepped closer slowly before answering. "Because you looked at me without wanting something." His eyes searched hers intensely. "Do you know how rare that is in my world?" Raven didn't answer, because part of her already understood exactly what he meant. Everyone around Ronan feared him, used him, or obeyed him. She was the first person who challenged him instead. Before the conversation could continue, one of Ronan's guards entered the penthouse quickly. The tension in the man's face instantly changed the atmosphere. "Boss," he said carefully, "we found another body." Ronan's expression darkened immediately. "Where?" "Near the south docks." The guard hesitated briefly before continuing. "They carved your name into his chest." Raven felt coldness spread through her stomach instantly. Ronan barely reacted outwardly, but something dangerous shifted behind his eyes. "Get the car ready," he ordered quietly. The guard nodded and disappeared immediately. Raven set her coffee down slowly. "What does that mean?" Ronan reached for his jacket without looking at her. "It means someone wants my attention." Raven frowned. "Who?" Ronan's jaw tightened once. "A man named Silas Kane." The name alone seemed to change the air around the room. Raven noticed even the guards outside suddenly looked tense. "Who is he?" she asked softly. Ronan buttoned his jacket calmly, but his eyes had gone colder than she had ever seen them. "The only man who ever came close to destroying my empire." Raven's pulse quickened slightly. "And now?" Ronan finally looked toward her. "Now he's coming back." Something about the way he said it made fear settle deep inside her chest. This wasn't just another rival. This was war. By evening, the tension across the city had become impossible to ignore. Ronan's casinos tightened security. His clubs closed early. Armed men patrolled outside every property connected to the Castelli Empire. Raven watched it all unfold from the penthouse balcony, while news helicopters circled downtown far in the distance. Even without understanding the full criminal world surrounding Ronan, she could feel the pressure building everywhere. Around midnight, Ronan finally returned from meetings with blood staining the cuff of his shirt again. Raven immediately stood from the couch. "Tell me what's happening." Ronan loosened his tie slowly, exhaustion shadowing his face. "Silas is targeting my businesses." Raven frowned. "Why?" Ronan poured himself a drink before answering. "Because years ago, I took something from him." Raven waited quietly. Ronan stared into his glass for several long seconds. "His brother." The silence afterward felt heavy. Raven slowly understood what he meant. You killed him. Ronan's voice remained emotionless. His brother betrayed my father. Raven looked away briefly, unsettled by how calmly he spoke about death. And now, Silas wants revenge. Ronan nodded once. He's wanted revenge for years. Raven glanced back toward him carefully. So why attack now? Ronan's eyes lifted slowly toward her face. Because he finally found your name. A cold chill moved through her instantly. Me? Ronan stepped closer. Silas believes you matter to me. His jaw hardened slightly. That makes you valuable. Raven suddenly remembered the attack inside the penthouse bedroom, the whispers in casinos, Vivian's warning, everything connected now. She wasn't caught beside Ronan accidentally anymore. She had become part of the war itself. The following night proved exactly how serious the danger had become. Ronan brought Raven with him to a private meeting inside an abandoned theater downtown where several crime families gathered secretly. The atmosphere inside the old building felt tense from the moment they entered. Armed guards lined the balconies. Men spoke in hushed voices near the stage. Everyone looked nervous. Raven stayed close beside Ronan instinctively as they moved through the crowd. For once, she didn't even argue about it. Halfway through the meeting, the lights inside the theater suddenly cut out completely. Screams erupted instantly. Gunshots exploded through the darkness seconds later. Chaos swallowed the entire building. Raven felt Ronan grab her arm immediately, pulling her behind a marble pillar as bullets tore through the theater. Men shouted orders everywhere. Someone collapsed near the stage. Another burst of gunfire shattered the balcony railing above them. Raven's heart slammed violently inside her chest while Ronan fired back toward the darkness with deadly precision. "Stay down," he ordered sharply. Raven covered her ears as explosions echoed through the theater again. Then suddenly, the emergency lights flickered red across the room, revealing masked gunmen storming through the aisles. One attacker raised his weapon directly toward Raven. Everything happened too fast after that. Ronan moved in front of her without hesitation just as the gun fired. The shot slammed into Ronan's shoulder violently. Raven screamed his name as he staggered backward, blood spreading rapidly across his black shirt. But even wounded, Ronan grabbed the attacker and shot him point blank before collapsing against the pillar beside her. For one terrifying second, Raven forgot how to breathe. Ronan looked pale beneath the red emergency lights, while blood soaked through his shirt faster by the second. "Ronan," her voice broke completely. Ronan grabbed her wrist tightly, despite the pain twisting across his face. "Listen to me." His breathing grew uneven now. "If anything happens tonight..." Raven shook her head immediately. "Stop talking." But Ronan tightened his grip harder. "If anything happens to me, you run." More gunfire exploded nearby. Guards rushed toward them through the chaos. Raven pressed trembling hands against Ronan's wound, trying desperately to stop the bleeding while panic consumed her completely. And in that moment, surrounded by violence and screaming and blood, she realized something that terrified her more than the war itself. She could not lose him. Raven pressed both hands desperately against Ronan's bleeding shoulder, while the abandoned theater collapsed into complete chaos around them. Gunfire echoed through the aisles. Men shouted orders from the balconies. Bodies covered the marble floor near the stage, while smoke drifted beneath the flickering emergency lights. Yet none of it mattered to her in that moment. All she could focus on was the blood soaking through Ronan's shirt beneath her trembling hands. "Stay awake," she whispered frantically. Ronan leaned heavily against the pillar behind him, breathing harder now, but even injured, his eyes remained dangerously alert. "I'm not dying in a theater," he muttered through clenched teeth. Raven nearly laughed from panic and relief at the same time. "Good," she snapped emotionally, "because I'm not dragging your body out of here." Two of Ronan's guards finally reached them through the gunfire. "Boss, we need to move now," one shouted urgently. Ronan forced himself upright, despite the pain twisting across his face. The second he stood, Raven instinctively wrapped an arm around him to steady his balance. For a brief moment, Ronan looked down at her holding him there, and something shifted in his expression. something raw, personal. Then, another explosion shook the theater violently, snapping everyone back into reality. "Get her out first," Ronan ordered immediately. Raven looked up at him sharply. "I'm not leaving you." Ronan's jaw tightened. "Raven, no." Her voice came out stronger this time. "I'm staying with you." For the first time since meeting her, Ronan looked completely powerless to argue with her. They escaped through underground tunnels beneath the theater, while gunfire continued above them. Ronan's men surrounded them tightly as they moved through narrow concrete hallways lit by dim emergency lights. Raven stayed beside Ronan the entire time, supporting part of his weight whenever he stumbled slightly from blood loss. Every few minutes, he tried pretending he was fine, but the growing paleness beneath his skin exposed the truth clearly. By the time they finally reached one of Ronan's hidden safe houses across the city, Raven's hands were covered in his blood completely. A private doctor was already waiting inside. "Get the bullet out," Ronan ordered coldly before sitting heavily against a leather chair. The doctor immediately began preparing medical equipment while Raven stood frozen nearby. Seeing Ronan injured disturbed her far more than she expected. He always seemed untouchable before tonight, too powerful to bleed, too dangerous to lose. Yet now she watched blood drip slowly onto the floor beneath his fingertips, while exhaustion shadowed his face. The doctor carefully cut through Ronan's shirt, revealing the full extent of the wound. Raven's chest tightened instantly at the sight. The bullet had torn through the upper part of his shoulder, leaving dark blood smeared across his skin and tattoos. "You should wait outside," the doctor suggested gently. Raven shook her head immediately. "No." Ronan glanced toward her briefly, surprised by the firmness in her voice. "Raven, I said no." She moved closer beside him. "I'm staying." Something softened behind Ronan's eyes again before he finally leaned back against the chair without arguing further. The procedure lasted nearly an hour. Raven stayed beside him through all of it, refusing to leave even once. She watched the doctor remove the bullet while Ronan endured the pain in complete silence, his jaw clenched tightly enough to reveal every ounce of control he possessed. Most men would have screamed. Ronan barely reacted, yet every time pain crossed his face, Raven felt it inside her own chest somehow. When the doctor finally finished bandaging the wound and left the room quietly, silence settled heavily between them. Ronan rested back against the chair, with exhaustion written across his features now. Raven sat across from him, unable to stop staring. "You took a bullet for me," she said softly. Ronan looked toward her, slowly. "Of course I did." The answer came so naturally, it stole her breath for a second. "Why?" she whispered. Ronan held her gaze steadily, despite the exhaustion weighing him down. "Because the idea of losing you," he stopped briefly, like even speaking the truth out loud cost him something. "It terrifies me." Raven felt her heartbeat stumble painfully inside her chest. This wasn't obsession anymore. It wasn't possession, or control, or dangerous fascination. Somewhere along the way, the ruthless Mafia king had genuinely fallen in love with her. And the terrifying part was realizing she had fallen too. Ronan slowly stood despite the pain in his shoulder and walked toward her carefully. "Raven," he said quietly, stopping directly in front of her. "If you want to leave after tonight." His voice lowered slightly. "I won't stop you." She stared at him in shock, because it was the first real freedom he had offered her since the night they met. Ronan looked exhausted, vulnerable even. "This life will only get worse from here," he admitted softly. "Silas won't stop." Raven looked down briefly before meeting his eyes again. "Do you want me to leave?" Ronan answered instantly. "No." His voice almost broke beneath the weight of the truth. "But I would rather lose you than watch you die because of me." Raven stepped closer, slowly, until only inches separated them. "You still don't understand me," she whispered. Ronan frowned slightly. Raven placed her hand carefully against the side of his face, her fingers brushing lightly along his jaw. "I stopped being afraid of you," A long time ago. Ronan stared at her, silently. Raven swallowed once before continuing. And somewhere along the way, her voice softened, you became the only place I feel safe. Something broke behind Ronan's eyes then. He pulled her against him instantly, kissing her with more emotion than control this time. The kiss carried everything neither of them had fully admitted aloud yet. Fear, relief, need, love. Raven wrapped her arms around him carefully, mindful of the wound in his shoulder, while his hand tightened protectively against her waist, like letting go would destroy him completely. For a few brief moments, the war outside disappeared entirely. There were no enemies, no gunshots, no blood. Just two damaged people holding onto each other in the middle of a violent world trying to tear them apart. When Ronan finally rested his forehead against hers afterward, his breathing remained uneven. You're going to ruin me, he murmured quietly. Raven almost smiled through the emotion burning inside her chest. Too late. But peace never lasted long in Ronan's world. Less than an hour later, one of his guards burst into the safe house with panic written across his face. Boss, he said urgently. We found Silas. The atmosphere changed instantly. Ronan's expression hardened back into something deadly, while Raven stepped away slowly. Where? Ronan asked, coldly. The old harbor district. The guard hesitated briefly before continuing. But there's something else. Ronan narrowed his eyes. What? The guard swallowed once. Silas left a message. He handed Ronan a phone taken from one of the dead attackers at the theater. Ronan pressed play silently. A distorted voice filled the room immediately. You should have stayed lonely, Ronan. Raven felt coldness spread through her stomach as the message continued. Because now I finally know how to destroy you. The recording ended abruptly. Silence swallowed the room afterward. Ronan's jaw tightened so hard she thought he might break the phone in his hand. Then slowly, he looked toward Raven again, and for the first time since meeting him, she saw pure terror hidden behind his anger, because they both understood the truth now. Silas Kane wasn't trying to destroy Ronan's empire anymore. He was coming for her directly. The silence inside the safe house after Silas Kane's message felt heavier than the gunfire from the theater. Ronan stood motionless near the table, gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned pale beneath the blood still staining his hands. Raven watched the shift happen across his face slowly, the rage, the fear, the realization that this war had changed completely. Until now, Silas attacked businesses, shipments, soldiers, but after that message, there was no confusion left. Raven had become the target. One of the guards stepped forward carefully. Boss, we can move her overseas tonight. Ronan didn't answer immediately. His eyes stayed locked on Raven, like he was fighting with himself internally. Finally, he spoke quietly. No. The guard looked confused. Sir? Ronan's voice hardened instantly. I said no. He tossed the phone onto the table before turning fully toward Raven. If Silas wants war, he said coldly, he'll get one. Raven crossed her arms tightly, despite the unease growing inside her chest. This isn't happening because of me alone. Ronan stepped closer. It is now. His eyes softened slightly afterward. And I should have protected you better. Raven shook her head immediately. Stop acting like I'm helpless. Ronan gave a faint, exhausted smile at that. That's exactly what scares me. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Raven looked directly into his eyes and said the words that changed everything between them permanently. Teach me. Ronan frowned slightly. Teach you what? Raven's expression hardened with determination. How to survive your world. The room fell silent again. Several guards exchanged uneasy looks nearby. Ronan stared at her carefully, almost like he was hoping she would take the words back. Raven. No, she interrupted firmly. I'm tired of hiding while people shoot at me because they want to hurt you. She stepped closer now, refusing to look away from him. If this war is coming either way, then stop treating me like something fragile. Ronan's jaw tightened slowly. Deep down, she knew part of him hated the idea completely. Not because he doubted her strength, but because teaching her meant accepting the truth he tried avoiding since the night they met. Raven was no longer separate from his empire. She was becoming part of it. Ronan finally exhaled heavily before nodding once. Fine. Raven blinked slightly. Surprised he agreed so quickly, Ronan looked toward one of his guards. Clear the lower level. The man nodded immediately. Less than 20 minutes later, Raven stood inside a private underground shooting range, hidden beneath the safe house, while Ronan loaded bullets into a handgun across from her. Rule 1, he said calmly, handing her the weapon carefully. Never hesitate. Raven took the gun with steady hands this time. Ronan stepped behind her slowly, adjusting her grip, while his voice lowered near her ear. Fear gets people killed. His hands guided her arms upward toward the target ahead. Control keeps them alive. Raven's heartbeat quickened slightly from his closeness, but she forced herself to focus. Ronan's world had already changed her, whether she admitted it or not. And somewhere, deep inside herself, she realized something dangerous. Part of her wanted the power to fight back. Over the next several days, Raven transformed faster than anyone expected. Ronan trained her personally inside hidden warehouses, private gyms, abandoned compounds owned by the Castelli Empire. He taught her how to shoot accurately, how to spot hidden weapons, how to recognize lies during negotiations, how to survive ambushes. At first, his men watched her with doubt. By the fourth day, nobody laughed anymore. Raven learned quickly because survival had always been part of her nature long before Ronan found her. The difference now was that someone finally gave her weapons instead of wounds. Yet the closer they became during those training sessions, the more dangerous their relationship grew emotionally. Every touch lingered longer. Every glance carried tension. Some nights Ronan would pin her gently against the gym wall after training, kissing her breathless while his hands gripped her waist possessively, like he needed constant reassurance she was still there. Other nights they argued so fiercely it nearly turned violent before collapsing into desperate kisses minutes later. Their relationship burned hot enough to destroy both of them eventually. And deep down, they both knew it. One evening after training, Raven sat beside Ronan on the rooftop terrace, overlooking the city lights, while he wrapped fresh bandages around his healing shoulder. "Do you ever regret this life?" she asked quietly. Ronan tied the bandage carefully before answering. "Every day." Raven looked surprised. Ronan stared out toward the skyline. "Power costs people pieces of themselves." His voice remained calm, but she heard the truth inside it. "Eventually you wake up and realize you don't remember who you were before all the blood." Raven studied him silently for several moments before speaking again. "I think there's still good inside you." Ronan laughed quietly at that. "You're the only person alive who believes that." Raven moved closer beside him. "Then maybe everyone else is wrong." 3 nights later, the war finally exploded completely. One of Ronan's casinos was bombed just after midnight. Flames swallowed the building, while terrified civilians ran screaming into the streets. News helicopters flooded the skyline. Police blocked entire districts downtown, but Ronan barely looked at the destruction, because minutes after the explosion, another message arrived from Silas Kane. This time, it contained only one sentence. "You taught her how to fight. Now watch her bleed." Ronan immediately understood what it meant. "Where's Raven?" he demanded, sharply. Panic spread across the room instantly when nobody answered. One guard finally spoke nervously. "She left an hour ago with 2 security vehicles." Ronan's face went completely cold. "To where?" The guard swallowed hard. "The charity gala downtown." Ronan grabbed his gun instantly. "Get the cars ready." Meanwhile, across the city, Raven stood inside a crowded ballroom surrounded by politicians, celebrities, and wealthy elites, pretending not to notice the criminal empires funding half the event. She wore a black dress. Ronan picked himself, elegant enough to silence every room she entered. But something felt wrong the second she stepped inside. Too many unfamiliar faces. Too many exits blocked quietly by men pretending to work security. Raven's instincts sharpened immediately after weeks inside Ronan's world. Then she saw him, a tall man standing near the balcony, watching her with pale, emotionless eyes. Silas Kane. Raven had never met him before, but somehow she recognized him instantly. The man smiled slightly before raising a champagne glass toward her from across the room. Her pulse tightened hard inside her chest. Then every light inside the ballroom suddenly went out. Screams erupted instantly. Gunshots exploded through the darkness seconds later. Guests scattered in panic, while armed men stormed the ballroom from every entrance. Raven dropped behind a marble table just as bullets shattered glass above her head. Her training took over immediately now. No panic, no freezing. She reached beneath her dress for the hidden handgun Ronan insisted she carry and fired toward the nearest attacker before he could reach her. The man collapsed instantly. More gunfire erupted across the ballroom while smoke swallowed the chandeliers overhead. Raven moved through the chaos carefully, remembering every lesson Ronan taught her. Stay moving. Never hesitate. Trust nobody. Another attacker rushed toward her from the hallway. Raven fired twice, without thinking. He dropped before touching her. But then, suddenly, strong hands grabbed her arm from behind. Raven spun instantly, weapon raised, only to find Ronan standing there breathing hard, with fury in his eyes. "Are you hurt?" he demanded. Raven shook her head quickly. Ronan grabbed her face roughly, checking for injuries like nothing else mattered. Then the ballroom doors exploded inward again as more gunmen entered. Ronan immediately pulled Raven behind him while firing back. "We need to move now," one of his guards shouted. But before they could escape, a slow clap echoed across the ruined ballroom. Silas Kane stepped through the smoke calmly, surrounded by armed men. "There she is," he said softly, while staring directly at Raven, the woman who finally made Ronan Castelli afraid. Ronan raised his gun instantly. "This ends tonight." Silas smiled faintly. "No." His eyes shifted toward Raven again. "Tonight is only the beginning." What happened after that night would become one of the bloodiest mafia wars the city had ever seen. Entire criminal empires collapsed. Politicians vanished. Loyal soldiers betrayed each other for survival. And at the center of all of it stood a former waitress named Vale, the woman who slapped the most feared mafia king in the city and somehow became the only thing he could not live without. But in the end, the most dangerous part of their story was never the violence, the power, or the war surrounding them. It was the fact that two broken people found love inside a world designed to destroy anyone who dared to feel it. And once Ronan Castelli realized he loved Raven more than his empire, there was no line he would not cross to keep her alive.